Boss fights. In many games, they're mostly the final objective for something that you typically give your reward at the end. And for many of them, usually they test you in one way or another, whether it be most of the game mechanics or simply a gimmick that they specifically have. And for Warframe's case, a lot of them mostly follow the same trope. And I wanted to go over most of the bosses in this game that do show these types of qualities. Throughout the star chart, whether it be your adversary or just simply something that you'll just find out in the wild in an open world area. This is my main review of Warframe bosses. Let's first lay down some ground rules. I'm mainly going to be going over two main things when it comes to any of these types of boss fights. The main design of the boss, what options a player has to fight against it, and the amount of preparation that they have, which all correlate into difficulty as a whole. And if need be, I will also mention if the boss fight has a pretty good reward at the end, incentivizing you to actually fight it multiple times. And for the most part, a lot of bosses are pretty fair game, though I won't be really including any quest bosses or really specific bosses that are just like not totally available. And if I do include a boss that has a super boss variant, I will take that into account. The Star Trek has a lot of bosses to offer, and for one of the first ones that you do fight...
Actually, Vor is the first boss you fight in the tutorial quest.
Okay, who the fuck said that?
Wait, no, please, don't hurt me!
The Jackal, I think, is one of the best boss fights that Warframe has to offer in general. Pretty much all it really does is just like shoot a couple bullets at you from either its front or back cannon, and then just stomps at you. And what comes after defeating one of the legs is quite possibly something that a lot of new players get trapped in, and that's the giant like grid wall attack. The attack basically more or less one-shots most players' shields at this point, unless they have a mod for it, and it'll probably do chunks of their health if they stay too close to it or stay too long in it. Your main counterplay is obviously going to circle, but some Tenno try to go behind cover, and that's not really the best option, because you could really just go right next to the Jackal and staying very close to the walls, and they don't rotate as fast as it does when you're farther away. Doing this 4 times in a row is more or less just the whole fight in general. It does get a little faster, it does get a little crankier, and the arena does go a bit smaller with the electric fields around it, but overall the boss fight isn't that difficult, but I think it's a great opening towards Warframe's bosses as a whole. And I think even DE knows that this boss is pretty good because they literally reuse it in the circuit, which could also be a baby Tenno's first experience with the Jackal as well. When it comes to other Star Chart bosses, really, I think the only other one that I could notably mention for its difficulty being the Ropalolyst. Similar to Eidolon's, it has a weak point, and you can only really do void damage to its shields. So, since it mimics the Eidolon fight so much, that's why I think it's probably one of the more difficult Star Chart bosses, primarily because of just that similarity and the fact that you have to go in and out between operator and whatnot. I think overall, this fight just flows nicely, and understanding the phases and whatnot is pretty easy thanks to what Alid says, as well as the fact that, like, it's just fun riding a giant sentient bird.
Yes, make that thing sizzle.
Overall, it's just a great boss, and I also just like it for its lore significance. Along with this, you also get a pretty nice Warframe being Wisp. So far, though, most of the Star Chart bosses don't really offer that much difficulty, which pretty much transitions into... Ah, yes. The wonderful open worlds of Warframe that are totally not buggy and totally don't leave you loading for like 15 minutes straight. All the bosses in between all the open worlds are pretty just enjoyable, and I also just like they all look aesthetically. Though choosing the best one out of all of them is pretty difficult because unlike the Star Chart bosses, they all have a unique gimmick along with a lot of options the player can choose from. For a newer Tenno, it's very difficult to get to these guys, since for Eidolons, you have to fully deck out your operator in order to actually deal consistent damage to the shields, along with getting pretty good weapons in order to actually kill them. Whereas for the Ore Mothers, Explorer is pretty easy to get into, especially with just you having to wait for an event. Though Profit Taker, on the other hand, I personally think this is quite possibly the best boss fight out of all of the open world ones. Primarily because you get a lot of options for this fight, and I also think the difficulty is perfectly scaled. Sorry, Damos Necromex, you guys are just kind of bummed. Profit Taker in general, you basically just have to get as much damage types on all of your weapons as you can. And I think that's just a pretty nice way of mastering out all of Warframe's damage types in general. Especially with, by the time you get to Profit Taker, it's pretty much set that you've gone through most of the game already. Along with this, I personally don't think Profit Taker's attacks are more or less unfair. In general, most of them have pretty well telegraphed motions, and for the most part, the real biggest hurdle against Profit Taker is just its defense. Going through all the weapon damage types, then having to use your arc gun, then having to break all the pylons, and then rinsing and repeating this process over and over again, it's pretty strenuous. Which is also why I really like this fight, because like I said earlier, it masters on those mechanics that you've learned throughout the game, while also being a fun way to introduce invulnerability phases in most fights. Especially throughout the star chart, a lot of boss fights in Warframe have to have invulnerability phases, simply because in this game, with the amount of loot that you can get, you could more or less one-shot any enemy, and this is more or less the easy way to balance out without having to just Omega break the game. Sure, you could do 90 million damage to one enemy, but if they have iframes, you can't do 190 million damage. It's essentially just let DE actually show off the fights that they have so that you can actually experience them without just thinking they're just an afterthought. And that's why Profit Taker quite possibly just has the best ones in general. You get to actively interact with the invulnerability phases. Unlike Vor, and especially Superboss variant, where you just kind of just shoot at enemies for a bit until he just decides to get back up. Along with Profit Taker, you also get a pretty good amount of cash, and if you're very efficient at fighting him, you can make a lot of money. Speaking of rewards,
All in this together.
Adversaries are a unique challenge in Warframe where you have to find out a 3-modded code in order to actually fight them. The first two, being Kuvalichus and Sister Ropalolyst, are just kinda in their fights. For the most part, the real challenge is trying to figure out the code against them, but ultimately they have Warframe abilities, but you kinda can just delete them in a few seconds, especially after you kill whichever first one you fight, because you can get one of their weapons, which more or less just helps out your damage. The main ones that I want to go over are the Technocyte Coda. These guys are quite possibly my favorite Warframe boss fight, primarily because of their unique challenge, especially with their main encounter. In the Railjack confrontation, the boy band decides to just do some random things, I guess, and start to throw out attacks that come from the stage itself. All these are very well telegraphed, especially the first part of it, and there is a lingering debuff that you get if you decide to mess up 3 hits in a row. The damage these stage attacks do basically one-shot all shields and almost all overguard, I believe. For the most part, if you just have the ability to consistently get a way to get your shields back and or overguard back pretty easily, you won't really have much problems with fighting the boss itself. But the stage attacks in general can very much deplete your resources if you're not readily prepared. But by this point, especially in the game, you probably have a frame that can deal with most things in general, so I wouldn't see this being much of an issue. The boy band's attacks in general mainly just consist of toxin and or random Warframe abilities, like one of them throwing out a larva or something. It's not too bad, it's just if you aren't really equipped to deal with the toxin damage, like bringing a shield gaining frame, you kind of might just explode. Though personally, I think the boy band themselves aren't difficult, it's just the main stage attacks that they do is probably the best part about them. For veterans, really, there aren't really many bosses that actively challenge us, as we usually have the loadouts to deal with these types of bosses, besides one exact boss type. The main 4 super bosses in the game are all obviously optional, and they don't really give that much of a reward. It's just a cosmetic for the most of it, or like a little title. But they are quite possibly the most difficult thing Warframe has to offer. Now, me personally, I have beaten all of them, though besides Vor and the fragmented one, I haven't actually soloed the other two. And there's a pretty good reason for that. It's because they're just difficult and annoying to deal with. And so I personally think that these guys basically just fit all their criteria with the ones that I mentioned earlier in the video. They're the most difficult, they give a lot of decisions and strategy making for the player, and also giving a pretty decent cosmetic. Though out of the four, I personally think that the Guilty is probably the best one out there, mainly because they have the least restricting rule set out of most of them, and it's more just a gauntlet that you have to go through, which is probably also why I had to just go into a public to just beat them. Excusing that fact, I just think overall the original bosses that aren't the hard mode variant are just pretty fun in general. I don't really have a problem with any of them, and them being empowered and a lot more imposing through this variation of them is just quite nice. Especially the Prime Vanguard. I think they are probably like my third favorite boss in the game. The aura forming at the start in general is probably the main thing that hooked me onto these guys. They're just a big ass gauntlet that you have to go through, especially with the ones that just come out for revenge after you beat one of them. The Guilty just enhances that by 100, especially with adding Trinity as a main healer to them. The other two, even in the Guilty, aren't that much different. I think the Ropalolyst is a lot cooler in the Arcwing variant, unless you just get like one tapped out of spawning in. But overall, the other two aren't that weak, at least in comparison. I just like the Vanguard overall more. I know this wasn't like a wholehearted review where I decided to go in depth with each of the bosses in general, but I just wanted to show some appreciation to DE and their boss fight design. They're all pretty unique and creative, and I hope they decide to keep continuing on with the super boss trend in the future, along with just making similar, newer boss fights similar to the Coda. There are a lot of bosses in this game, and I just more or less cherry picked the ones that I like the most. But are there any other ones that any of you guys like? Then just discuss it below. I'd like to hear any other thoughts regarding Warframe boss design, especially with the Star Chart ones that are a lot more earlier. I want to know if anyone really out there likes Tilragor, especially with the whole Equinox grind tied to him. Anyways, thanks for stopping by, Tenno, and make sure to just appreciate a boss fight that you've been probably grinding for a single chassis part for.